In my household, we're always the people that made the Band-Aids. We used a lot of them, but and I'm sure that there's a whole lot more that you're doing right now. Perhaps you can tell us a little bit about what's Johnson & Johnson looking at in healthcare data right now.
Sure. So just to provide a bit of background, we, of course, do much more than just Band-Aids, as you mentioned this. We have 3 sectors. Most of you are familiar with the consumer sector, which basically does things like baby shampoo and Band-Aids and things like that. And we have another sector in the medical device sector, which that's actually where we started, suture material and so forth, as well as knees for knee implants and hips as well. And then lastly, pharma, which is sort of today our largest sector. So it is very cool to think of some of the more recent tech companies as data companies. Google and so forth comes to mind. But I think I would submit that J&J is very much a data company. A lot of our products that we develop have to be approved by, say, the FDA. And to do that, we want to demonstrate that they work, and we have to collect reams and reams of data to demonstrate that. And so I would say that all along, we have been in the data business. It was never quite as explicit because we sort of do it through clinical trials and so forth. But at the end of the day, what we do in that set is data collection, and we identify the right tool, the right molecule, or what have you not, and then we submit it to a clinical trial. And clinical trial is a laborious way of collecting data as opposed to sort of the exhaust way of collecting data that has become popular more recently. So data has been there all along and part of the development. In addition, we are finding now that a lot of the stakeholders that we have, payers, but also providers, are very interested in data, not just as they were used to approve a product, but also as they're used in practice. How is this particular drug truly used? What are the economics surrounding it? What are the outcomes? What are the patients? And so that kind of data we are very aggressively collecting for our various sectors.
And I mean, as we're going to obviously get into in more detail here later on tonight in the panel discussion as well, there's obviously a lot of challenges. I mean, for us at ReadWrite, we're talking about IoT and the connected world across a lot of verticals, and that big data challenge is there for everything. In healthcare, there are the extra dimensions too, privacy and other issues that may not be relevant to other sectors. Maybe you could talk a little bit about what kind of challenges Johnson & Johnson sees about dealing with that data, dealing with this new tsunami of data that you're seeing.
Yeah, so privacy obviously it's a very important topic, and it's interesting that privacy, we treat that very seriously, like other companies as well. But when you look at consumers, they think of privacy sort of not in a black and white fashion, but in a continual fashion. And what I mean by that is there's some information that they happily give away on Facebook day in, day out. And there's some information that they don't, that they keep very much to themselves. And so the classic examples there are data related to reproductive health and data related to mental health. Those are sort of the most closely guarded. Legislatively and regulatorily, we don't distinguish those, so we treat all these data separate and protected. We want to do that. So that's an important aspect in going through that data and helping making value in that. And one of the things that we find is that patients are actually very interested in sharing some of the data under the right conditions. And typically, if they get direct value out of that, and a very simple example of that is our clinical trials. In those clinical trials, patients give us tons of data. They give us data about themselves, they give us the clinical data, and all of that they give us freely. Well, freely to the extent that we either reimburse them for that, or they expect that they or people like them will benefit from the treatments that come out of that. So that's, I think, an important part of how patients think about it. What is much harder to convince patients of is, give me data, and then through a very roundabout way, it's going to benefit people somewhere else like you.
Right. Excuse me, if that's, I think, one of the biggest challenges around data in this space is the perceived fear, I suppose, of the end users, of patients, of consumers, in the case of a fitness wearable today, let's say, who are worried about if I give you access to this at Johnson & Johnson, what's ultimately your end goal going to be? And I mean, how do you see that as sort of putting people's mind at ease, or what does Johnson & Johnson really want to get out of having all that data, and what would be the ideal way or format that they would want to see that come in to make that easier for you as well?
Yeah, so one of the things that one of the things in clinical trials in particular, but it's also true for some of the real-world evidence studies, is this is always driven by researchers, and I'm a recovering researcher myself, so I know what I'm talking about. And one of the challenges as a researcher is twofold. Either you ran your study and you didn't think about these 3 data elements that you should collect, and then afterwards you kick yourself and then just have to run a whole new study to get those data elements as well. So that's option number 1. Option number 2 is you just collect all the data that you can, and you have patients and physicians that are frustrated with this incredible amount of data that's getting collected. And so we're trying to obviously strike the happy medium there. The other thing that we're starting to explore now is actually, to what extent can we give some of that data in the clinical trials back to patients? So they have given us the data. This is on typically 6 months, 12 months, maybe a couple years. This is valuable data for them to know about themselves. And so we're experimenting. What is it like to give that data at the end of the study so that the blinding and so forth is taken care of back to patients?
And that is, I mean, I think that's probably going to be understood here by most of the people who are here in the audience today. But that is atypical for how that usually works in clinical trials, correct?
Yes, it is very atypical. We decided a few years ago that we wanted to rethink how clinical trials are done. And the first innovation was a very simple one. We decided to send a thank you note to all the participating patients. Right. And I was shocked that that was actually an innovation. Wow. So this is how far the industry has to go in terms of where we're at. But we're on the way.
I don't know what that says about the healthcare industry today. Okay, well, in that vein, what is the thing that will make it easier, do you think, to get beyond sort of that, acknowledgement of them beyond a source of data, I guess? What is the thing that will make those end consumers or patients comfortable, do you think, to ultimately want to be okay with the way that data is transmitted?
Yeah, so we have, as a company, we sort of using health technology now much more assertively in a way of thinking about how we want to go into the future. Data is part of that, but not the whole thing. So how can we help patients that undergo orthopedic surgery prepare for that surgery and perform better during that surgery? How can we sort of have people be their best self? How can we have patients that suffer from diabetes go better through that whole process? And this goes back to the point that I made earlier. The more closely tied the connection is between the data that the patient gives and the benefit that the patient gets, the better. This is true for clinical trials, but it's also true on the commercial side. Patients have, in many disease areas, have a tremendous affinity for that group. So breast cancer is one example, many disease areas as well. And they're happy to contribute to that community if they're seeing as active as coming back to them and to the community more broadly. And to do that, they have to make sure that there's some kind of a degree of impartiality, and it's not just about the money, but it's sort of about the deeper disease burden that can be alleviated.
And that's a really interesting point of discussion around that, because this is something that gets mentioned a lot in the digital world more broadly beyond health, is this idea of community, and all of social media channels are basically bent around creating a community. It may be very small or maybe very large. Around healthcare, I would think that is a rallying point for end consumers or users of that technology. Is there, and like you said, I think it might naturally happen around something like breast cancer versus something versus obesity or something else. I'm not sure. Just to use an example, is there something in there about how the community is sparked off by that technology that makes that easier for people to want to rally around it and really join that?
So what makes it relatively, I don't want to say easy, but facilitates the formation of a community is sort of the tips and tricks. Right. So if there's wisdom that can be readily passed from one patient to the other, that ferments a very strong ground for a social community. Right. And so that can be, how do I deal with this kind of thing? And the reason this is valuable is because the physicians, they know sort of the high-level general case, but they don't know the specific case. Well, how does this apply in this particular case if you've had 2 children and da-da-da, these kind of complexities? They don't think about that, right? And oftentimes, so then the second level that often deals with that kind of thing in the clinic, at least, is nurses, because nurses sort of see the patients more often and so forth. But it is not unusual for nurses to tell us that they themselves were shocked by what the experience truly was like from what they had experienced before, sort of as a counselor and advisor. And so the patient social communities serve that purpose of transferring some of those things, but also as a support group. And it is very important to think about, it is very, people that are not suffering from a particular disease often don't get me, right? And so if you are able to bond with others that do get it because they're in the same position, there's a degree of sympathy, of empathy that you can get out of that, and a degree of not being alone that is very valuable.
Right. That goes kind of beyond the support group kind of, where you actually have a shared experience that is verifiable by data that's coming out of it. You touched on that about nurses as well. And I mean, there's a lot of links in the healthcare ecosystem for the average person, you know, the average patient or the average consumer. I mean, what are some of the best practices that you might see around, you know, for the various links in that chain, or what might you be teasing out of that for best practices from this data collection and analysis?
I would take a step back before talking about the data piece. I think one of the best practices that we have taken is a couple of those. One of them is a lot of things are about changing behavior. And I think the previous talk by John really goes into that. Behavior and behavior change will be critical to address a lot of the diseases that we have out there, or at least the slowdown that we experience. The other thing is that while we want to make sure that we treat patients as consumers, and with consumer what we mean is people that have power, that can make choices, and that have alternatives, we also want to make sure that we don't bypass the physicians. And in many cases, that's what has happened in the past, and as a result of that, the physicians have not embraced the activities that were done. And so I think those are sort of the key learnings that we would say.
And that's really, you know, it can be really challenging for a patient who feels that their level of care isn't what they thought it was, or they're having, you know, they may be adjusting to a new reality for themselves, or whatever may be happening to them personally, and they may look at their, you know, the providers in their healthcare ecosystem and try and say, oh, that broke down here. It's not. I mean, this is also kind of a way that can make that that understanding, socialize that understanding perhaps better in this group, that maybe it wasn't a diagnosis, or it wasn't a harsh diagnosis from somebody else, and to run off and get a second opinion or do whatever, that maybe, you know, maybe this socialization of information really helps with that.
Mm-hmm. I mean, one of the things that when you are a patient, and eventually I guess all of us become patients, and you find yourself in the healthcare system, you realize that it almost feels like at times being held together by duct tape. Right? Things aren't as you might imagine they are. And that's in part because of the evolution of the times. It used to be that you were in hospital until you were well. Now you're in hospital until you can go to the bathroom by yourself, and then you're out. Right. And that's a completely different experience, because when you're well, you get treated, and it takes weeks on end, and then finally you're actually fully functioning. Now, when you go home after a major disease, a major surgery, you are not able to do it by yourself. You need a lot of help.